A man finds a grizzly bear cub injured and alone on the side of a mountain trail. Against every instinct, he decides to help. But just when he thinks he's alone, the trees around him begin to move. One by one, full-grown grizzlies step into the clearing. What they do next left him, and everyone who hears this story, in tears. This is not fiction. This is what happens when you show compassion in the wild. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. It helps us bring more powerful stories like this one to you. The forest was still that morning. Jake Morrigan wasn't a ranger. He wasn't a hiker. He was a mechanic from Bozeman, Montana, 43 years old, tired of city noise, grieving the sudden death of his younger brother, Luke. All he wanted was 3 quiet days alone in Glacier National Park, where they used to camp as kids. He didn't expect the silence to be broken by crying. It was faint at first, barely more than a whimper, but unmistakable, high-pitched, panicked. Animal. Jake froze on the trail, then followed the sound. Just off the path, tangled in a patch of brambles, was a bear cub. Small, no more than 6 months old. Its leg was cut and bleeding. It whimpered with each tiny movement. Jake's first thought, where is the mother? His second, why can't I walk away? He crouched, careful, slow. The cub flinched but didn't run. It was too hurt. Jake removed his backpack, unzipped the first aid kit. He kept his eyes on the trees. Grizzlies didn't forgive threats to their young. He worked quickly, using gauze and alcohol wipes to clean the wound. The cub whimpered, but let him. Jake whispered softly, voice low like how he used to talk to his brother when Luke got scared. There we go, buddy. Hang in there. It took half an hour, but when he finished, the cub looked calmer, still weak, still bleeding, but calmer. Jake stood and backed away slowly. You'll be okay. He turned to leave. And that's when he heard it, the heavy snap of branches. Not one, not two, but several. He turned. They were coming. From the trees, shadows emerged. One, then another, then 3 more. Bears. Grizzly bears. Massive. Silent. Watching. Jake froze. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. He had no weapon. No spray. Nothing. The cub behind him let out a small call. Not fear, but something else. A response. One of the larger bears stepped forward. Its fur thick, dark, face grizzled with age and wisdom. Jake held his ground. This was it, he thought. He had tried to help, and now he'd die for it. But the bear didn't charge. Instead, it walked past him, straight to the cub. Then another came. Then another. Jake stood in the middle of something impossible. A circle was forming, around the cub, around him, and not a single growl, not a single roar, just presence. The oldest bear, maybe the mother, let out a deep, low sound. The cub whimpered and nudged forward, and the group stood together, motionless, unified, breathing, watching. Then, as if on some silent cue, the largest bear looked at Jake. Their eyes met. No rage, no threat, just recognition. And then the bear did something Jake would never forget. It nodded. Not human-like, not cartoonish, but intentional. Then it turned, and slowly, they all disappeared into the trees. Jake dropped to his knees, shaking, not from fear, but from awe. The clearing returned to silence, but Jake would never hear silence the same way again. Jake stayed in the clearing long after the bears were gone. He sat on the forest floor, heart still pounding, hands dirty with pine needles and dried blood, the cub's blood. But his mind wasn't racing with fear anymore. It was something else, something heavier, a kind of stillness. The bears had left no trace, no sounds, no broken branches. They had disappeared as silently as they arrived, like ghosts. Only they were real. Their size, their power, the way they moved. Jake would never forget it. But it wasn't their presence that haunted him. It was the way they looked at him. Especially the oldest one, the one he believed was the mother. That look. Not animalistic, not threatening. It was like acknowledgement. Jake had seen people cry over far less. He rubbed his face and realized he was crying now too. Slow, quiet tears. Not because he was sad, not because he was afraid, because he had just witnessed something few people ever do. The moment a wild animal chooses to trust a human, and that kind of moment changes you. He stood up slowly, brushing off the dirt. His knees ached. His pack felt heavier. The trail back to his campsite looked longer now, but he didn't leave right away. Instead, he walked to where the cub had been lying. The blood was still there, dark and wet in the moss. He stared at it, unsure of what to feel. Then he noticed something. A shape. In the snow nearby, faint but visible. The outline of a paw print. Large. Fresh. Facing him. He knelt down. It was almost perfectly formed. The claws. The pad. But what struck him most was the placement. Just a few feet from where he'd been standing when the bears surrounded him. The big one had stood there, watching, judging, and letting him live. He touched the edge of the print and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know why he said it, but it felt right. Jake made his way back to camp in silence. Every creak of snow beneath his boots felt louder now. The birds seemed to fly differently. The wind had a new weight. He reached the small clearing where he'd pitched his tent. His fire was long out, his food untouched. He sat down, suddenly exhausted, physically, emotionally. His brother Luke had always believed in this kind of stuff. Energy, animal spirits, the connection of all things. Jake used to laugh at him for it. But now he wasn't laughing. He pulled out his old notebook, the one he'd only used to jot grocery lists or quick oil change reminders. And for the first time, he began to write. "I helped a cub today. The herd came. They didn't hurt me. I think they understood. I don't know what this means yet, but I know I'm not the same. He closed the notebook and placed it beside his sleeping bag. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trees like distant drums. Jake stared at the sky for a long time that night, and though no bears came back, he felt them. Out there, watching, protecting their own, and somehow protecting him too. Not because they owed him anything, but maybe because they recognized something in him. And now, he had to figure out what to do with that recognition. The next morning, the snow had hardened under the cold. Ice glazed over pine needles and fallen leaves, and the prints Jake had followed the day before were frozen in place like artifacts. He knelt by one again, the large paw print, the one he had touched after the bears disappeared. But now, in the sharp light of morning, it looked different, smaller, more ordinary. Doubt crept in. Maybe he'd imagined the nod. Maybe the bears weren't watching him with awareness, just instinct. Maybe the whole thing, the tension, the stillness, the perceived trust, was just adrenaline and grief playing tricks on a lonely man in the woods. He stood and looked around, half expecting to see one of them again. Nothing. Just trees, snow, silence. He let out a shaky breath. Get a grip, Jake. But deep down, something in him pushed back. No, that had been real. The silence wasn't empty. It was meaningful. Still, when he reached the ranger outpost later that morning, a half-day's hike from his campsite, he didn't mention the cub or the bears. The young ranger on duty, a guy named Brandon, nodded politely as Jake signed the log sheet and grabbed a weather report. They made small talk about temperature drops and trail closures. Jake almost said it, almost asked, "Has anyone reported bear activity near Lost Pine Ridge?" But he didn't. What would he say? That he bandaged a cub's leg, and a whole herd of grizzlies watched him do it, then silently approved? That one of them nodded at him. He could already hear the laugh, the raised eyebrows, the friendly but skeptical chuckle. So instead, Jake asked something else. "You ever seen a bear cub alone? Injured?" Brandon looked up from the logbook. "Sometimes, but not often. Cubs don't last long without their mom. If one's hurt and alone, that's usually the end of it." Jake nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. Brandon studied him a moment. "You okay, sir?" Jake offered a quick smile. "Yeah, just thinking." He left soon after, but the words stuck in his head all afternoon. Cubs don't last long without their mom. Unless they're found and protected by more than just instinct. That evening, Jake returned to the site where he'd treated the cub. The bloodstain was nearly gone, buried under a thin dusting of snow. But new tracks had appeared. Several. Clear. Adult bear prints, and something smaller walking alongside them. The cub. Alive. Jake felt it in his chest, like a fist unclenching. But something else caught his eye. A boot print. Not his. It was off the trail, too far for a ranger, too close for comfort. Someone had been watching. Jake knelt, fingers brushing the edge of the tread. Heavy, deep, recent. The bears weren't the only ones in the woods, and not everyone who entered the forest came to heal. Jake stood, breath visible in the cold, and looked out at the growing dusk. If someone else had seen the cub, if they followed the herd, he couldn't shake the thought. Not all humans would see what he saw. Some might just see opportunity or threat. He zipped his coat and looked into the woods, not with fear, but with purpose. He had come here to grieve. Now he was part of something larger, maybe even responsible for it. And as the cold night rose around him, one thing was clear. If the cub had been spared, if he had been spared, it wasn't for nothing. Jake didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the trees outside the tent felt sharper now. Every gust of wind sounded like a step in the snow. He kept thinking about the boot print. Who was it? A ranger off trail? A poacher? A curious hiker? But he knew the truth in his gut. That tread wasn't random. It was deliberate. The stride, the depth. Someone had been tracking, watching, maybe even close enough to see what happened in the clearing. And if they had seen the bears... Jake rose at first light, packed fast, and headed back toward Lost Pine Ridge, the site where it all began. The hike took 2 hours, maybe more. The sky was bruised with early snow clouds. The wind was louder than usual. By the time he reached the ridge, the forest felt different. Not dangerous, but disturbed. Birds didn't sing. No fresh animal tracks. Just a heavy silence, like something had passed through. He checked the brambles where the cub had been caught. Gone. Clean. But nearby, another boot print. Same tread, same direction, headed northeast. And something else. A pile of bait. Raw meat, tied off in burlap, half buried beneath leaves. A trap. Jake's stomach turned. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were hunting. And not deer. He knelt down, examining the site. No snares, no spring traps. Not yet. But the bait meant they were getting closer. Trying to lure the cub? Or the adults? Jake looked around. No movement. Just trees and wind. But every part of his body screamed that he was being watched. He took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. 1 bar of signal, barely enough to text. He opened a message to the ranger station. Suspicious activity near Lost Pine Ridge. Bait discovered. Possible poacher. Bears in area. Please advise. He hit send, heart pounding. No confirmation. No ping. Signal gone. He stared at the screen, willing the message to deliver. Then, quietly, he slipped the phone back into his coat. He had a choice to make. He could leave. Hike back. Tell the rangers in person. Let the system handle it. Or he could stay. Watch. Follow the signs. Be the one to stand between the bears and the man in the boots. He didn't want to be a hero. He didn't even want to be here. But something inside him, the same something that made him stop for the cub, that made him hold his ground when the herd appeared, wouldn't let him walk away. He remembered Luke again. His brother always used to say, "If you're there when something's wrong, you're already part of the story, so you better decide how it ends." Jake stood, hands tightening around the straps of his pack. "I'm not letting you end this one ugly," he said aloud. Then a sound broke the silence. Not human. A huff, a grunt, from the ridge above. Jake turned slowly. And there, not 20 yards away, stood one of the bears. It wasn't the cub. It was one of the adults. Broad, powerful, fur dark and shimmering in the early light. They locked eyes. No fear, no threat, just awareness. Jake didn't move. He didn't have to. The bear looked down at him, then back toward the woods, in the exact direction the bait had been set. Then, as if confirming something only the wild could understand, the bear grunted and disappeared into the trees. Jake exhaled shakily. He knew what he had to do now. He wasn't just going to protect them. He was going to find whoever laid that bait and make damn sure they never got close again. The sky was turning gray. Snowflakes fell slow and steady, coating the forest in quiet. But Jake wasn't watching the sky anymore. He was tracking footprints, boot prints. He followed them carefully, moving through dense brush and shallow gullies. Every few steps, he paused to listen. The wind in the branches, the distant crack of ice, the faint call of a bird. But also for something unnatural, off rhythm, human. He found it an hour later, a makeshift camp nestled beneath an overhang. There was a camo tarp, a small fire pit still warm, and a duffel bag full of raw bait sealed in plastic wrap. Jake crouched behind a fallen log, heart pounding. Whoever this was, they were close. Then a voice. Didn't think anyone else knew about this trail? Jake turned slowly. A man stood 10 yards behind him, holding a rifle casually in both hands. He wore a thick camo jacket, wool gloves, and a face that looked too calm for the situation. Jake stood up slowly, hands visible. "Didn't mean to trespass," he said. "Just hiking. Saw your bait." The man tilted his head. "You with Fish and Wildlife?" "No." "Then why do you care?" Jake hesitated. "Because there's a cub, and a herd, and I saw your trap. I don't think you're here for deer." The man smiled, cold and sharp. "They're just animals." "They're alive," Jake said. "They're dangerous." Jake stepped closer. "So are people with rifles and no conscience." The man raised the barrel slightly, not aiming, not yet. "You think they'd hesitate if it was you?" Jake's breath came hard now. "They did." The poacher blinked. Jake didn't wait. "I was with that cub. I treated it. I was surrounded by at least 5 adults. Not one laid a claw on me." He pointed toward the trees. "You know why? Because animals know the difference between a threat and a choice. I chose to help." The man's jaw clenched. Jake continued, voice low. "You come back here with a kill in mind, they'll know, and they won't show mercy a second time." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, a deep, guttural growl from behind. Both men froze. The poacher turned. At the tree line, less than 30 feet away, stood the same grizzly from earlier, watching, muscles taut, ears forward. Not curious now. Guarding. Behind him, in the shadows, the silhouette of another, and then a third. Silent. Still. The man gripped the rifle tighter. "Don't," Jake warned. "You won't get a second shot." The man didn't lower the gun, but he didn't raise it either. The lead grizzly took one step forward. Jake moved slowly, stepping between the poacher and the bears, arms out wide. "This isn't your forest," he said softly, "and it's not your fight." The wind shifted. The poacher looked at Jake, then at the bears. Then he turned and walked away. No words, no warning, just retreat. Jake waited until the man disappeared into the trees. Only then did he turn around. The lead bear stood still, snow clinging to its fur. Jake didn't speak. He didn't bow. He just looked into those deep, unknowable eyes. The bear blinked once, and then it was gone. No growl, no charge, no death, just understanding. Again. Jake sank to his knees, breath heavy, arms shaking. This was no longer about just survival. This was about witnessing, about knowing, finally, where he stood, and who he was willing to become. 2 days passed. The poacher never returned, or if he did, the forest made sure he didn't get close again. Jake stayed. Not out of fear, but out of something he couldn't name yet. Responsibility, maybe. Reverence. A feeling that he had been invited into something sacred, and you don't walk out on that kind of thing without leaving something behind. He gathered the remaining bait he had found and burned it. He flagged the ranger station again, left coordinates, a full report. Brandon had hiked up later that afternoon, listened without judgment, and said they'd send in an official team next week. "You want to go back down with me?" Brandon had offered. Jake had shaken his head. Not yet. Now, 2 mornings later, he stood at the edge of the same clearing. The place where the cub had cried, where the herd had come, where the forest had seen him for the first time. He took off his gloves and walked into the center. The snow had melted in patches. The bloodstain was gone. But the memory wasn't. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, a carved wooden disc, smoothed and sanded by hand. On it, etched with a pocket knife, was the silhouette of a bear cub and a man, side by side. He knelt and placed it under a tree, tucked into a groove at the base of the trunk. Not as a marker, as a promise. "I don't know what you saw in me," he said quietly, "but you made me remember who I used to be, before the world got loud, before grief made me cold." His voice cracked. "I lost my brother, and I lost myself, but I didn't lose you, not when it counted." He stayed kneeling for a while. The wind picked up. The scent of pine filled the air. Then, a sound. A shuffle in the brush. Jake looked up slowly. From the trees, the cub emerged. Larger now, steadier. No limp. It stepped out cautiously, eyes locked on his. Behind it, one of the adults. The same bear that had stood at the tree line, the one who had spared him. Jake didn't move. The cub approached, nose twitching, sniffed the air, took 1, 2 careful steps closer, then stopped, no more than 4 feet away. Jake lowered his eyes, then opened his hand slowly, palm up in the snow. The cub looked at it. Then, unbelievably, placed its paw beside it, not on it, not touching, but beside, side by side. Jake felt tears rise again, not painful ones, the kind that don't come from loss, but from fullness, from being witnessed, from being seen and accepted. He looked at the cub and whispered, "You remember me." The cub blinked once, then turned and trotted back to the trees. The older bear gave him one last look, deep and heavy and still, before turning too. And then, once again, they were gone. But this time, the silence that followed didn't feel like absence. It felt like closure. Jake stood and exhaled, chest light for the first time in years. He walked out of the clearing, not faster, not slower, just present. And behind him, tucked beneath that tree, the carving remained. A man and a cub. A moment etched not just in wood, but in memory. Jake returned to Bozeman 1 week later. He didn't tell many people what had happened, not because it wasn't real, but because some stories don't survive small talk. They're too big, too sacred. But something in him had shifted permanently, and people noticed. He moved slower, spoke softer, listened deeper. He stopped drinking. He reopened Luke's garage, not to run it as a business again, but to turn it into something new. A quiet place. Half repair shop, half workshop. One corner was reserved for wood carving. Another held a small photo wall with pictures of Glacier National Park. In the center hung a framed drawing. A man standing beside a bear, drawn by a 10-year-old girl who had heard him speak at the local library. She had asked him what it felt like. What felt like, he'd said. To not be afraid of them, she'd replied. Jake had smiled. I was afraid, but I chose something else. He started giving small talks, not big lectures, just quiet conversations, at schools, hiking clubs, wildlife events. He never used words like miracle or spiritual. He talked about presence, about patience, about how silence isn't always empty. One evening, after a talk at the Montana Wildlife Conservancy, a ranger named Leah approached him. "Did you really treat a cub's wound in the field?" she asked. He nodded. "And they let you live?" "I don't think it was about letting me live," he said. "I think it was about letting me feel again." She paused. "That's rare." Jake looked at her. So are second chances. Later that night, back at the garage, Jake opened the drawer of his desk and took out the small wooden disc he had carved again. He had made another copy after leaving the first one behind. He turned it slowly in his hand. The memory hadn't faded. He could still feel the cold in the air, still see the cub's eyes, still remember the way the lead bear looked at him, not as a threat, not even as an equal, but as something worthy of coexisting. He thought of Luke again, how angry he'd been when he lost him, how numb he'd become, and how, in a clearing full of giants, something cracked open, not in the forest, but in his own chest. Jake stood, placed the carving on the shelf, and walked outside. The night was quiet. No cars, no music, just wind through branches and the distant sound of a train. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if it was to Luke, or the cub, or the forest itself. But it didn't matter, because some stories aren't about answers. They're about echoes. And Jake's story, the story of a grieving man, a wounded cub, and a moment of impossible peace, would echo forever. Not in headlines, not in books, but in the hearts of anyone who heard it and chose to believe that compassion matters, that courage is quiet, and that even in the wildest, rawest places on earth, mercy still lives. If this story inspired you, remember this: courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a quiet choice to stand still, to protect what can't speak for itself, and to listen when nature speaks back. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who believes in second chances and the power of quiet kindness. Together, let's echo that message as far as it will go.